I'm Matt Guichard, and this is No Holds Barred. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about stalking. Today's episode, we're talking about stalking, the criminal offense of stalking. And under Penal Code Section 646.9a et seq, we can see what the definition of stalking is. I like to actually read from the jury instructions because that's really what the law that a jury would get from a judge in a case in which there is an allegation of stalking against a defendant. And I will say that part of the training as a prosecutor is the first place you go when you're looking at charging a crime is the jury instructions. See what are the elements that need to be proved. And yes, you can go to the penal code. That's very important. But I think the actual words that a jury hears from a judge in definition. So I'm going to just initially read here 1301 of CalCrim. The defendant is charged in count 1 with stalking in violation of Penal Code Section 646.9. To prove that the defendant is guilty of this crime, the people must prove that the defendant willfully and maliciously harassed or willfully, maliciously, and repeatedly followed another person, and the defendant made a credible threat with the intent to place the other person in reasonable fear for his or her safety or for the safety of his or her immediate family. And it goes on. It goes on to talk about the enhancement if in fact there's already a restraining order in place. But let's just go back and talk about that first count, the defendant willfully and maliciously harassed or willfully, maliciously, and repeatedly followed another person. That's what we think about stalking, is somebody following a person. So oftentimes we've seen cases where there's a prior boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, prior husband-wife relationship, whatever, and one of the individuals is driving around repeatedly around that person's neighborhood, up and down the street, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that certainly can be deemed stalking, done with the malicious intent. It's done with an intent to harass or cause a threat. And in fact, it does cause a threat. And so many times somebody will call, look, my ex-boyfriend has threatened me. I have a restraining order against him, and he continues to drive up and down my street in front of his house. Now that would be a violation of the restraining order. And that's a little different. That there's some enhanced things that we have here in the law. But just initially, without a restraining order, driving back and forth or following somebody. Wherever I go, that person follows me. Wherever, and I'm scared. And I go to school and they follow me. They follow me around school. When I get out, I see them parked across the street. I go home, they drive up and down. That's what we think of as stalking, and that certainly is stalking. But stalking can be, as we know, willfully and maliciously harassing. So what can that mean? That means we've had cases in which somebody sends 300 texts in a day or 300 emails over and over and over again with the intent, maliciously, to harass that person. And that indeed can be stalking. We have kind of a relationship with stalking, and we had talked in a prior episode about criminal threats. And the two many times can be charged together, not only stalking, but criminal threats. But think about that. What is the intent of the person who's making the threat or stalking? And that is to harass a person or to willfully and maliciously follow that person. So we want to be very careful about those. So for any of you who have a restraining order against somebody, it would preclude calling them, making contact with them by any means, texting, emailing, social media, anything such as that, threatening them in any fashion, and following them, or being, in many cases, within 300 feet of them. Sometimes we have a difficult thing where two people live in, say, the same apartment complex. One person has to walk by somebody else's door to get to theirs. And okay, they can actually do that, but they don't get to stand there. They don't get to walk by, 100 times. They can go to and from. But all of those things are very much to keep in mind about this. If in fact there is a court order in place, the jury is to find, if you find the defendant guilty of stalking in count 1, you must then decide whether the people have proved that a temporary or permanent restraining order was in place. And that's fairly easy to prove at trial. Here's a restraining order. It's signed by the judge, submitted to the court, and to prove. So they have the people have the burden of proving the allegation beyond a reasonable doubt that in fact there was in place a restraining order. Pretty simple. And that a credible threat is one that causes the target of the threat to reasonably fear for his or her safety, or for the safety of his or her immediate family. And again, we go back to that criminal threats, we go to stalking. So keep in mind, stalking is more than just following. So it is that harassing. It may not rise to the level of a felony criminal threat to kill somebody or to cause great bodily injury. That's kind of the difference I want you to understand. But the idea of harassing multiple emails over and over again, and they don't have to be a threat. They can just be harassing, continuing to harassing. We see it often at work, somebody calling multiple times at work and causing harassment. And the people at work say, you got to tell this person no, I don't want to talk to that person. You tell them to stop. And finally, it gets to the level of you have to contact the authorities. And the authorities means contact the police, make a police report. That police report will then be taken over to the district attorney's office, and the district attorney's office will make a decision as to whether or not that rises to the level of stalking under this section of 646.9. So I do want to get on and say a little bit about a credible threat may be made orally or in writing or electronically, or may be implied by a pattern of conduct or a combination of statements and conduct. So keep in mind that harassment can be more than just a statement, walking back and forth, driving around, showing up at work multiple times and being asked to leave. Harassing, under the jury instruction, means engaging in a knowing and willful course of conduct directed at a specific person that seriously annoys, alarms, torments, or terrorizes the person, and that serves no legitimate purpose. So we often had something that now we can use stalking, but we would have annoying or harassing phone calls. And that can be a misdemeanor offense. And it is the idea of multiple calling over and over and over again. And here we have it in stalking. That can rise to the level of harassing. So a course of conduct means two or more acts occurring over a period of time, however short, demonstrating a continuous purpose. So driving in front of the house a couple of times can rise to the level of stalking. Driving back and forth multiple times, harassing and annoying and threatening is something you can't do and is a violation of the law. Someone commits an act willfully when he or she does it willingly or on purpose. So someone acts maliciously when he or she intentionally does a wrongful act, or when he or she acts with the unlawful intent to disturb, annoy, or injure another person. So again, it can be your neighbor playing drums and you've asked them to stop, and they continue to play and play and play long into the night, long past a reasonable time, and they do it to harass. So we can see this in these instructions that actually talk someone who makes a threat while in prison or jail may still be guilty of stalking for the same reason. Now they're confined, they can't get out, but they can stalk by harassing electronically. when we talk about immediate family, and I mentioned it in the criminal threats, and I want to mention it here in stalking. The definition, immediate family means any spouse, parent, children, any grandchildren or grandparents, brothers and sisters related by blood or marriage, or any person who regularly lives in the other person's household or who regularly lived there within the period of 6 months. Now, that's a pretty broad range, but again, the whole purpose for these statutes and these laws, both criminal threats and stalking, is to put somebody on notice to deter them from harassing someone. So don't stalk them, don't threaten them, don't harass them. And if you do, you're going to be subject or potentially subject to stalking, and as I said before, potentially those criminal threats. So we know criminal threats can rise to the level of a felony if made. They want to kill or they want to have great bodily injury committed against a certain person. And stalking is more simply harassing, but the same level of fear and the same annoying that takes place. So I want you to appreciate that and appreciate that if there's a restraining order in place, there's a height level. So that is all I'm going to talk about this particular area of the law, but very important for people to understand, because people often ask me, somebody said that they were stalked by a person. Well, what does that mean? And sometimes it's important to let people know, I didn't realize that was a crime and somebody's been doing that to me. So I do have a right to call the police and make a report. And that is absolutely correct. Now, I've read a lot of information to you on this issue of stalking. I think that's important because I think you should know what the law is and what must be proved. But that doesn't mean you can't think, well, what about other things? And we often hear about, let's talk revenge porn or revenge anything that relates to somebody getting information about a person and publishing it for the purpose of harassing and annoying them. That potentially could rise to the level. Now, we have other statutes that talk about the criminal conduct related to publishing that kind of thing. It can be a libel or slander. It certainly can be in that defamation framework. There are other things that we can look at, but the real question is, what exactly is stalking, and how can we keep somebody else from harassing us or stalking? And obviously, the first step is contact the police. Many times, the police will say, "Get a restraining order." You can go to court, and there is a desk in most superior courts where you can sit down and they will help you prepare that restraining order. I always like to say, once you get a temporary restraining order, the best thing to do is retain counsel to help you at the hearing to make that a permanent restraining order. But all of those things can come into play. So again, almost anything you can think of where you're being harassed or you're concerned, and whether it's phone calls, multiple texts, driving by your house, following you, anything like that. So I do have cases in which people have called me and said, look, I've got a restraining order in place. And one case in particular was people lived together in an apartment complex, and one continued to harass, got a restraining order, and but they lived in the same community. And so the person kept walking back and forth, lived in an apartment complex. One lived on the lower level, one lived on the upper level. But the harasser continued to walk up and down the stairs, back and forth, so that the person being harassed felt that they couldn't even go out of their house. They didn't want to see this person. They didn't want to confront that person. And in my view, clearly it was a violation of the restraining order, and we went back to court. And in fact, the court found that to be true, a violation of the restraining order. And the district attorneys actually filed a misdemeanor stalking against that person. So we see that. I think the biggest issues that I've run into when I'm looking at these cases are the telephone calls, multiple telephone calls. So in one case, we had a person who received 32 telephone calls in the middle of the night, and they were all from the same person. She didn't answer the phone calls, but she had an answering machine. So the calls came in, and she heard them. No message left most of the time, but the calls kept coming in and coming in and coming in. And she could look back and see they were from the same number. She knew who that person was. She had asked them not to call, not to harass. And guess what? That case was reported to the police. And again, the district attorney filed a misdemeanor complaint for that annoying and harassing phone calls. In today's world, we probably would file those as a stalking case. I have one final example, and I will say that it was kind of a funny case in which a person was going into cars that were unlocked in an apartment complex and taking material out of them. That's not a car burglary because the cars were unlocked, and just rifling through stuff and getting information. And the person found a yearbook and saw a name, saw that same name was a person in their apartment complex, and began calling them. And it wasn't the same person. Ironically, two women with the exact same first and last name lived in the same apartment complex. Well, this person who was going through all the materials thought it was one person, and in fact it was another, and made multiple phone calls asking for dates, and the person who was actually receiving the phone calls was, you gotta stop, you just have to stop. And finally, we got the local police agency. This was when I was a DA, to at the time you could put a device on the phone to see where the number came from, found out where it was, went and confronted the person, and in fact was making annoying and harassing phone calls. The irony of that was that investigation then led to the identification of the harasser as the person that was going into multiple cars and taking items, and was also charged with a number of petty thefts for taking property of another. Could never prove actually that they were car burglaries, breaking into a locked car, but kind of says that he bought himself a lot more grief than he thought by doing these harassing phone calls, thinking he was going to get a date with somebody, and in fact he was calling the wrong person. The moral of the story then is, of course, don't make harassing phone calls, and please don't stalk. Please don't. And it's a wide statute that takes in lots and lots of activity. And I always like to say, look, if somebody doesn't want to go out with you, go find somebody else. Don't harass somebody on the phone or by text or by anything. And if you are in prison or jail and you're contacting somebody to dissuade them as a witness, that can be a felony, and that's a whole nother ballpark. So not something you want to do. If you find this episode on stalking interesting, you have any comments or questions, please ask them, and I'm happy to review them and answer those questions in a future No Holds Barred. Otherwise, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you at our next episode of No Holds Barred.